Well, welcome to this special event of MSK Innovations. I'm really grateful today to assemble some of the real thought leaders and industry leaders in the musculoskeletal field. And honestly, as you look at the screen, you know their faces and immediately you know their names. They're recognizable. They're professionals that really are key people in this industry. And so the whole point of today is really to be helpful to the 237 people who registered, which is to provide some insights. And have an honest conversation from the other side of the table. A lot of companies, I talk to CEOs daily, and there's a lot of commiseration about the markets and how hard it is to raise. And VCs don't tolerate risk anymore. They're acting more like PE. It's just there's a lot of, I think, angst, a lot of frustration. And so this is really to be helpful. And this is to provide a chance for you to be what would, probably take you an act of Congress to have you sit down with one of these three gentlemen and pick their brain for some, 20 minutes, a half hour. So today is really just to do that, to have an honest conversation. And I want to just start by asking this question. Have things changed? Are we in a different world today than we were, say, 5 years ago? And just, talk amongst yourself. This is just, us guys sitting here. There's no order or anything. Just talk and get it going.
I think biggest thing that's changed from my viewpoint is with the strategics, the large companies themselves, the consolidation or spin outs. Spine is an entirely different world than it was 5 years ago. You have, VB Spine may end up being all of spine when we get done, as there's probably more divestitures coming. Obviously, Globus will continue to be a big competitor there. But it's so you have far fewer companies in spine. You see far fewer companies really competing in trauma. And it doesn't feel like a wonderful time at the strategic MSK company space right now, except for perhaps Stryker, who continues to do very well. Globus on a smaller side that's doing well. And I think this is a space that flourishes with more big companies doing well. And I think we're in a cycle that we'll come back out of. But once J&J sells or spins off diffuse synthes, I think we'll begin to see that cycle begin to come back.
What do you think is driving that? Is that a product of some of these dual source and sole source contracts that hospital group systems, IDNs are doing with just one company and locking, most of the other companies out? Or is it more to it?
I guess I'll go for one more. I think I don't know if it's dual single source or dual source as much as the VAC approval process itself, making it very, very challenging for companies. And I think in spine specifically, there just wasn't enough differentiation. There's only so many different ways you can fix levels of the spine together and have it really be creative and interesting and innovative. And so I think those companies really started losing their thought process on what's possible to develop the marketplace.
Yeah,
But
maybe I'll. Oh,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to just
Please.
double down on that. Like the orthopedics is not dead. The demographics are incredibly strong, but what we've seen in the last 5 years, pricing, margins, profitability, leading, to what Mike said about divestitures, consolidation, that's probably going to continue. I agree. You're seeing traditional venture money move to debt and notes. You see equity going to, post FDA and even post commercial traction. Some of the bigger checks going into pain or biologics versus your traditional 510(k) implants. I think to me, we're at an inflection point, is those of us that play in the musculoskeletal space, what are we going to learn from that? And what are we going to do differently? Because, as Mike said, we can't just keep trying to repeat the same model. And, it's just going to be insanity. So what are what are the companies going to do differently? And the investors, what are we going to drive differently to strategics than, what's been, done in the past? And I think we'll probably get into a little bit more of, how that's done today.
Yeah, I think those are both really good comments. I mean, I think it's from an M&A perspective. I mean, we have seen some tuck-in M&A, in MSK. I think that the companies that are really novel innovations, fulfilling portfolio gaps, they're not necessarily a iteration on something a lot of these strategics already have. I think we're seeing those companies continue to get picked up, and it's been, I think we're optimistic. We've seen a couple companies get out successfully from an IPO perspective too. Those are MSK companies, and obviously that's an important path to keep open. M&A and both IPO. Not every candidate or company is a candidate for both, but I think just the fact that we have, seen a couple of those get out, they're trading, reasonably well. I think it creates some optimism for all of us that I think we're likely to see, an uptick in both M&A and hopefully, more IPOs to come.
So, question on that. I was talking to a CEO of a public company who was lamenting over what seems to be the market's inability to price the medtech space, especially orthopedics. What do you think is driving that, or do you think that's a legitimate observation?
I mean, at least as we've talked to bankers and our advisors, I think the bar has definitely moved. I think the bar used to be, do you have 20, 30 million in revenue and a great growth story and a great market opportunity? And I think now it's really more about scale. And so I think, as you think about just potential for being an IPO candidate, I think it's probably no longer that 20 to 30, it's probably 40 to 50 plus. And really having clear product market fit validation and kind of a path in a big market. So the bar has definitely moved, but I don't think, it's closed necessarily for good stories.
Yeah, I mean, our fund, we go upstream and we do, jump into that gap a little earlier, getting in either before human POC or regulatory quite often. Pricing that, so many people are doing notes now. There's, not a ton of priced rounds in those earlier stages. And, that's partly why we go there is if we're going to lead, in that space, it gives us a little more, term sheet flexibility. But you're right. There is a gap there, and pricing that is tough. I would encourage companies. What allows us to price things is de-risking milestones, and those companies that are committed early to generating data. High quality animal data, not just animal data on their own, but comparing to some of the key competitors or market incumbents, generating clinical data before regulatory, not after. Those are things that allow us to de-risk and allow us to price, as opposed to, the promise of, you're going to commercialize and that's where the risk is going to be removed. We like to see the opportunity to generate real evidence before the FDA so we can de-risk and, makes us more comfortable pricing.
So just thinking about sort of the ideal, everybody has their own thesis. Each of your firms have a different thesis. Maybe you could each kind of share what your kind of Goldilocks investment opportunity, what it looks like.
So we'll start on our end. I mean, for us, it's a $5 to $25 million revenue company that's growing, but needs significant capital, but also significant help. Generally, primarily in commercialization. We have founders who've gotten to the point that they can get to and need support and need to figure out how to commercialize and how to recruit and who's going to run their company if they're not going to run their company, or if they're going to run their company, how do we surround them with talented people who can? All these companies are generally going to be cash flow and EBITDA negative. They're burning cash to grow, but with very high gross margins. And our horizon is, if we don't have a clear picture of how to exit in a 3 to 4 year time period, not that we expect them all to get there, we won't get in the first place. We want to put a lot of assets in quickly and run fast.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the next one. We're a surgical and procedure focused thesis. We're writing checks between, 500,000 and 2 million. But we are definitely favoring, everybody says category defining, but to us, that's differentiated technology with evidence behind it in a big market. And to me, the thing that moves the needle for us, and I said it earlier, is the willingness to generate data to back up that value proposition, not just the promise and your conviction, but will you, if you have 3 to 4 bullets of your value prop, are you generating data that others besides yourself are going to believe is credible? Other investors, your clinical advisory board, and strategics. to validate, that the more validation you can get, the better. But if you're willing to generate that data and evidence early, that certainly stands out to us.
Yeah, made from our perspective. So we're medtech focused fund. I'd say med device is the majority of what we do. We're pre-stage agnostic, so we'll do everything from company creation to late stage commercial and everything in between. Like most venture funds, we have a 10-year fund, and so I'd say on average we're targeting whole periods of 3 to 5 years, and so that a lot of times you work backwards from when you think an exit could realistically occur. That's an art as much as it is a science, and I think we try to pick our entry points based on that on a category dependent basis. And then we're typically, I'd say, trying to find opportunities where we can get an average position of 35 million. And so our first check is probably 10 to 15, 10 to 20, and then we'd look to build a more concentrated position over time.
That's helpful. So one other question that comes to mind, I think, as you have your theses and they all lay out, you kind of know what you're looking for. But a lot of times what we are better at recognizing is the things that are more red flags, the things that just like, that's a showstopper, that particular factor, feature. And so what I'd like is to just maybe share some different things that from your seat, when you look at a company and you see something, whether it's the cap table, whether it's the leadership, whatever it happens to be, maybe it's the IP, if you could just kind of give us some honest feedback, what you really consider to be a red flag, maybe not a total deal killer, but concerns you.
Yeah, I'll jump on that, I guess. To me, it always starts and stops with leadership and the management team. Is it the key person that we're depending on, or is a true bench strength there? So it's a bit of a marriage. We're not doing this for a year or two. Sometimes you can be with these companies for 10 plus years. So, do I like the CEO, and are they working with conviction and passion and filling the gaps and listening and learning as they go? I think with that said, have they done the work on truly getting clinical and market validation? And if they haven't, that's a red flag to me. Have they spent as much time on commercialization, capitalization, and exit planning as they did on the unmet need and the science? And, are they really committed to generating data and proving things before the FDA? And then one that just pops up all the time is they've signed a red flag to me. They signed a ROFR with someone early, and that's just sort of out of the blue there. But a ROFR signed early on to me is a huge red flag. But I see it all the time.
I think if we're trying to verify that the product or service or tech that the company has works, I think one of the topics we're going to talk about today is where do you raise money prior to us, and where do you raise it in pre-revenue stages? Although I think Greg and Nick both will invest there, but the early stages are having a much tougher time raising money. Where do you get the money? And it always turns out to be surgeons, friends of the founders, who can be some of that capital. But oftentimes the majority of the revenue as well. And it's no problem. We fully understand. If they invest, they were excited enough about the technology to invest. They're probably excited enough to use it. Oftentimes not, but they should be, of course. But we got to see some verifiable amount of revenue that's coming from non-conflicted sources, and depth in accounts as opposed to ones and twos everywhere is another thing that really shows us that the product is sticky. And if we don't see that, and we see lots of ones and twos everywhere and lots of conflicted or semi-conflicted customers, those are early red flags.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what both Mike and Nick said. I think for us, table stakes, probably for all of us, right, is you have to have a really differentiated technology. You have to be solving an actual unmet clinical need. You have to have a big market opportunity. You have to have, probably 4 or 5 realistic buyers. Then you have to have a great team that can kind of pull that all together and execute. And then when you step back and you map that against the life cycle of a medical device, it's product development, clinical, regulatory, market access and reimbursement, commercial. I think the more that you have to, when you're doing all those for the first time, right? You're the first developing a technology like yours. You're the first one to design the right clinical study. You got to go pioneer brand new reimbursement codes, and then you got to go commercialize. and all those risks are stacked, that makes it really hard to get in early because those oftentimes, while those are the most exciting stories often in medtech, those can be 8 to 10 year plus journeys, and it's hard to kind of fit those within the venture model. And so I think for us, we spend a lot of time on just what are the risks stacked, or is there one or two? And I think the more often than not, you have to take risks, but I think more often than not, you're taking risks on potentially one or two of those dimensions and not three or four. And if you're taking on three or four, you may not be able to invest as early as you'd like. You might have to wait until two of those are retired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I think the next, sorry, go ahead, Drew.
Go ahead. No, please.
Next point on the need for data. Yeah, for me, if we're trying to find really innovative products that are changing the space, changing the indication, changing the surgical outcome, the first question is, does it work? And so if the product or service is something that everyone just knows, yeah, this works, it's been done before, it's a new version of it, great, then the need for data is probably a lot less. But a lot of things that we look at that are really neat. I mean, the founders are telling you, we've got this breakthrough device that works. And the first question is, well, does it? And an unwillingness to really collect the data. We've seen that recently in a couple, companies that are doing serious revenue. But especially when you get into the pain space, you get a lot of worries about whether there is any data that works. And it's one thing to run a company. You can run a company and generate enormous revenue without data, but the strategics aren't going to buy it without data. And so if your game is to sell, and you're not collecting early, you're just never going to sell. We're not going to get involved if we can't ever exit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can we maybe shift the conversation to the old adage that smart investors invest in the jockey more than the horse? So you got a great product, but you got a leadership team or a CEO. Maybe it's a surgeon founder, physician founder. I think that's one that we see with recent frequency, probably increased frequency, and I love it. I love to see these entrepreneurs, these physicians. But how do you view that from your seat? You see a surgeon who's moonlighting as an entrepreneur.
Well, I was a surgeon for 10 years. I maybe sit in an interesting seat there. First of all, if you're not a full-time CEO, I'm out. I don't care whether you're an engineer, a business person, a physician, or some combination. If you're not a full-time CEO and you're not fully committed to what you're doing, that's the red flag right there. There are a lot of, very successful serial physician, entrepreneurs, but that's the minority, not the majority. The surgeon's advantage as being the founder or CEO is that they have a good idea of what actually matters clinically. I mean, I think that's the big advantage. But surgeons are trained to trust their judgment in an operating room under uncertainty and be able to make those decisions. In the market that works in the operating room, that doesn't always work in the market, where you need to be listening to multiple other parties, investors, other surgeons, strategics, even bankers, to get your feedback on what's going to work and what's not. So to me, a surgeon entrepreneur or a physician entrepreneur is challenging unless I see that they're really hiring good teams. They're building a good board, a good leadership team. They're filling their gaps. They're adding good technical and business expertise to their clinical expertise. And then if they're doing that, that's actually an advantage. But oftentimes that's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Nick said. I mean, I think for us, it's it's definitely always the team, right? I take a team with a mediocre technology versus a fantastic technology without the team any day of the week. And so the advice I give to founders, and I think a lot of us do, is it's okay if you haven't done this before. I think that's the great thing about entrepreneurs is they have a great idea and they bring it to fruition. The best thing you can do is exactly what Nick said, is there's known case studies in our space. And so go surround yourself with people who've done exactly what you need to do. If you need to go run a randomized trial, go find somebody who's run a randomized trial before. If you need to scale in a certain segment, go find someone who's built a sales force and scaled there. And so a lot of times, whether that's advisors or board members or even management team members, that's just as important as you as the entrepreneur, the founder. And I think the earlier you can get those people around the table, the more it gives confidence, I think, for an investor to come in and say, okay, we've got a couple people that have at least lived some aspects of the story before and have the scars and the learnings from it.
I think we might be in a little bit different position on this in that we might vote for the technology without the jockey. I guess in our last three investments, we needed to bring CEOs in. That was with working together with the founders. So we're not the big private equity tell you one thing and then come in and take everybody out. We're very transparent with everybody right from the beginning. In this case, the founders wanted new leadership, and so so our idea of bringing teams in to great technologies that have proven themselves in the marketplace, we're really comfortable putting an entirely new team around a founder who becomes a CTO and then running fast with it. We think there's a lot of people in this space who get excited about these kinds of opportunities, and we're comfortable pulling those kinds of teams together. As long as we have the market experience with the product or service to be comfortable that we're going to be able to sprint with it.
Yeah, I always say, do you want to be a successful entrepreneur or do you want to be a CEO? Right? Because if it's like comes to like the question about physician CEOs, are you willing at the right time to take a different seat in the car to keep it driving forward? And that humility and the ability to see that gap and see it as actually the bigger opportunity, I look for that early. So yeah, that's a great point. Is sometimes the CEO doesn't have to be the CEO at the end. I think probably majority of the time who founded the company as the CEO and who's there when they exit are often different people.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit about data rooms? I know they're important, and the goal is to get people to dive into the data room. What are some data room blunders that you've discovered that are showstoppers in mid cycle?
It depends where we are in a deal. I think the need for a fully functioning data room with tons of data at the beginning is less important than getting the key information that we want. But when we're deep in the diligence, we need a fulsome amount of data that's up to date and correct and not constantly having to ask and have it get delayed. But I'd say every one of them looks different. What they put in, how they put in it. We try to give them guidance, but from a blunder perspective, it's just not, from our perspective, be just not providing the information we need when we need it.
Yeah, I'd say in a context of a data room, I mean, it's, like Mike said, I think they're all different and there's no perfect setup, but I think the main thing is no investor is going to take anything in the data room at face value. It's a starting point, not an entry point. And so I think for us, it's more about how do we start with where your perspectives on all the areas we're talking about are: market, reimbursement, commercial ramp. And then we're going to go do our own work, right? We're going to try and validate with our own, experience in the space, with our own advisors, with our own physician contacts. And so I think it's really just kind of putting a base in there that someone can kind of pressure test with their own work and just making sure you have enough there that people can do that. And you're objectively transparent, right? I think I've never seen a pitch deck that doesn't have $1 billion plus market opportunity. And if you actually audited how many $1 billion revenue generating products there are in medtech, it's not a super long list. And that's okay. There's plenty of, successful medical device companies between here and there. And so I think just being objective and not feeling like you have to present everything in a favorable light and just being honest about what the challenges are, because we're going to run them down. And I much prefer when someone's very open and honest about, the challenges, what they're doing about it versus just painting the, rose-colored glasses picture on everything.
So you're saying
the pitch deck is more of a problem. I think the pitch deck is more of a problem than the data room.
Okay.
I mean, so, the most common slide that, we use, every company's got to get to $100 million in revenue within 5 years. And we've been collecting data now since we've been doing HealthPoint now for 8 years. We've been collecting all of those decks. We've been tracking all of those companies to where they actually got to. And the number is painful. It's less than 25% of where they said that they would get to.
Mm-hmm.
It's significantly less than we estimated
Mm.
where they would get to,
Mm.
even though we haircutted the hell out of them. What I tell the companies are that if I don't believe one of your slides strongly, I don't believe any of your slides.
Mm.
And so if you're utterly going to make up revenue or pipeline or approval or whatever it is, because you think you have to, and it's completely unbelievable, and you've rendered for me your entire deck unbelievable.
Mm.
So I think people should be very careful listening to advisors of what has to be in your deck. If we don't believe what's there, it's a really bad start.
Yeah, maybe I'll give an example. You're right. They all have that. It's going to be $1 billion exit. And that you just chuckle when you see that sometimes. But if you're going to say, I know that here are my tier one acquirers, big company 1, 2, 3, 4, and here's my tier two acquirers, and I'm very confident. My typical question after that is, well, who did you meet with and what did they say? Right. So if you've got an exit slide in there and you got a big number beside it, I want to know, okay, well, what did they tell you they need to see for you to be successful? Data, regulatory, commercial, what do they need to see? And I would say 80% of the time when I'm dealing with earlier stage companies, the answer is I haven't talked to them yet. And we're done. If and I'm just being black and white sometimes to make it easy. There's no reason you shouldn't be talking to future investors, key opinion leaders, surgeons or business key opinion leaders, or your strategic acquirers early and often, to help refine that story, to help, inform what you're going to have to do. What is the bar you've got to get over? If you're just guessing or you're afraid to talk, or I've heard, I don't want to show them, all of my IP. Well, you don't have to, but at least if you're going to put those logos on that slide, then I'm going to ask you, who did you talk to?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, the single most impactful thing that can happen in early diligence for us is, regardless of the stage a company's at, is if we call the people we know at the strategics, or we call kind of the key opinion leader physicians in that space, and we all know who those are, in any given space, and they say, oh yeah, I've seen that technology, I think it's kind of interesting, that goes a long way. And so I think to Nick's point, the sooner you can just start socializing your story and building that relationship so people are at least familiar with it, and we hear that as kind of a positive echo chamber, that speaks volumes, right? Because people are tracking it, you're on the radar. And so I think that's great. I think the second thing I'd say is, know your case studies. So I think as investors, we tend to think in case studies a lot. We all track a lot of these companies, these spaces. And so when you put a comp up on your slide for 3, 4, 5, $600 million, and that company had to build a $50+ million business and raise several $100 million, you got to have an answer for either, how you're going to do the same thing with less capital, or why your valuation is starting at a point that even if you have to follow the same path, you could still achieve that outcome. And so I think it's, the comps are all publicly available, but I think what's more impactful is when someone says, hey, we're a lot like story XYZ. Here's how we're similar. Here's how we're different. And because that's immediately where we go when we see new technology, is what's been similar and what's been tried in that space, and what were the successes and failures.
Yeah, don't assume that we don't have the ability to call the surgeons, other investors, the strategics you have on that slide, and get that feedback. And, I'll give an example of one that, Greg and I just invested in. But, I got to 15 people in one day, you getting feedback, a mix of, surgeons, other investors, strategics, as well as commercial leaders, and got that feedback quick. So you have to assume that, our network is going to get to those people. So if you're going to put their face, if you're going to put their faces in there or their logos in there, you got to assume that we're going to double check, and we have the ability to, get to the same kind of folks. And if they don't know who you are, or they don't think that it's an interesting opportunity, it's better for you to know that before you're telling us.
Mike, you brought up slide deck. How many is too many slides in a pitch deck?
If it takes more than 20, something's wrong.
Yeah,
I don't know. There's not really a correct amount, but yeah, there certainly is too many.
Yeah, I always say, if you got 30 minutes, I don't want to see slides. If you got an hour, it's 20 and they better be done in 20 minutes so we can talk about other things. If I see that it's 40 or 50, I'll say, hey, you got to revise that before you come and talk to us, because there's no way we're going to get through it.
And if you're talking to any of the three of us, you can take all the market stuff out.
Yeah.
And please don't try to present it.
Yeah, I mean, it's you know your audience, right? Like Mike just said, if you're going to talk to a generalist investor that doesn't do a lot of ortho or even a lot of med tech, you got to have that context in there. But if you're talking to folks that have been there and done that in, you know, the musculoskeletal world, get to the, you know, what's the amazing part quicker.
Yeah.
And I always like on the first slide, I want to see why we're here and what you're asking me for. I don't want to wait. Don't wait for the punchline on the last slide.
Yeah, good.
I don't have much to add. I mean, the one thing I'd maybe add that I think not a lot of people do, but it's really impactful when they do, is I think you should realize, like, you know, investors, like all of us, we all have biases, right? Like, we've seen stories, we have predetermined opinions about various spaces, right or wrong. Probably wrong many times is right. And I'd say at the end, I would encourage people to ask, you know, what do you think about the space? Have you spent time in it? What are your key questions? And I think that kind of arms you with what are the, you know, roadblocks you got to potentially run down, and just understanding what people's biases are, what their predetermined conclusions are around market, et cetera. And that's going to help you craft your next discussion a lot more impactfully and enable you to go run down, how do I kind of get over the barriers that this person may or may not have?
Great. Great thoughts. So I think maybe you can each, I mean, Nick and Greg, you both just shared, you participated in a recent round. Maybe you guys can explain that just so that everybody has some context around what are your most recent investments. That might be helpful.
Yeah, Greg, go ahead on that one. You led it.
Yeah, so happy to. So yeah, Nick and I recently co-invested with mutual capital partners in Tiber Health. They have a collagen-based hydrogel for tendon, ligament, and soon to be nerve repair. And you know, early stages of Series A that we recently just closed on last month. And so the company, you know, probably had a quarter or so of actual commercial experience, and so was not scaled by any means. And so, you know, what made it stand out, you know, to Nick's point earlier, great science, right? And great science can mean a lot of things, but I think it was a, you know, really strong scientific founder, really spent the time on, you know, benchtop animal data research, you know, had a publication in Science Translational Medicine, which is a high impact journal. And so even though they didn't have large randomized controlled trials, anything you'd want to ask about, whether that's mechanism of action, effects, et cetera, they had really good answers to, you know, with just animal data and biomechanical data. And so that went a long ways. And I'd say a lot of companies, you know, I think could take a page out of that book, because it really helps, to Nick's point, de-risk things down the road. I think the second thing, great team, you know, just again, scientifically rigorous, great backgrounds, great people that, you know, were already on the leadership team that have been part of similar, you know, MSK stories. And then I think the last was exactly what Nick said, which is just the ability to call people in the industry, whether that's strategics, physicians, et cetera, and get, you know, kind of even the people that weren't on the company page and they had heard of it, were tracking it, liked it, validated the unmet need. And so I would give the entrepreneur, Tim Keene, there a lot of credit for, you know, doing a lot of legwork, where when we make those kind of unprompted calls to people that aren't on the advisory page, they were aware of it. So.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I agree with everything that Greg said, why we like the company. You know, great CEO, big market opportunity, strong data and commitment to science, and, you know, some early commercial momentum. But, you know, even though I'm an early stage investor, I was hearing about this technology for 5 years, right? And been hearing from Tim, you know, for the last, you know, 3+. So it really was, you know, a courtship that, you know, ended up culminating at sort of the right time. But just for those out there, you know, investments like this don't happen, investments period, they don't happen overnight typically, right? So to me, it was a courtship for years that, you know, it culminated at the right time in the right place with the right check. But it was knowing what was coming and constantly being updated along the way until it was the right time.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. I think my first discussion with Tim might have been in 2022 or 2023, and we invested in 26. I think it just shows like the importance of building the relationship, following up occasionally, and, you know, at a certain point you're going to be in any particular investor's strike zone. And so it's just about keeping people up to date with positive updates along the way.
That's great. Mike?
Happy to go. Yeah, let's see. A lot of questions coming into the chat room.
You have a lot of questions coming in. Let's go ahead and take one.
Do you not want to answer the question of your most recent
Our last investment? Sure.
Yeah.
So our last investment was a neat company called Immersive Touch. It does virtual reality surgical planning and augmented reality surgical execution, more in the craniomaxillofacial and thoracic space, although the technology is applicable throughout the body. And it's hard to find companies in this kind of tech that actually have revenue and lots of customers. And these guys have revenue, they make money, they have lots of customers, and really neat tech for doing all the parts of the surgery and planning out, being able to basically travel in, if it's in a cranial, a skull-based surgery, travel inside the head, you're inside the head with virtual reality on, and do the surgery with the patient's own CT and MRI, move things around, move bone around, find your gaps, look at blood vessels, nerves, muscle, bone, all or none, plan your surgery, build a model that you can use in the OR, or build custom implants that you'd use in surgery. It's super slick, and that company is growing rapidly. Augmented reality, they'll do in thoracic cases where they essentially give the surgeon X-ray vision before the surgery. They can see through past the skin and see the fractures, the fragments, all again muscle, blood vessels, nerves, organs, and it saves in those cases half an hour, 45 minutes of surgical time in every case. So that was a neat one that's musculoskeletal, but not necessarily as mainstream as some of the other things that we've done. But love that company. That's a company where we absolutely love the team that was there, and continue to grow it.
That's great.
I do have one question I think there's some relation to what we're talking about right now. It's from Vita Glatt. It says, how do investors view biologic technologies for bone healing that have already been de-risked through extensive preclinical testing and clinical use in more than 120 patients, yet still face reluctance from investors because of the perceived FDA regulatory risk? What would give investors the confidence to move forward? Since we've been talking a lot about collecting the data.
I think one question. Go ahead, Greg.
No, you got it, Mike.
One question I have, and you see a lot in the biologic space, is approval for the indications that they're actually being used for are often very different things. So it's a bone substitute is an approval that you see platelet, you see PRP, you see stem cells, you see all kinds of things under this bone substitute category. And so, again, we're not planning on holding these companies or investing in them for a long time. So we're going to want to sell them eventually. And the large companies are not going to get involved if the approvals are not for the indications that these things are actually being used for. So there's lots of neat products out there that are doing quite well, but they're doing it under very generic approvals. And so I guess my first question for whatever the company or technology is if they think an approval is upcoming, what is that approval for, and is it for a specific indication, not a broad-based one that's not relevant?
Yeah, I think strong differentiated data and the smart pathway through the FDA leads to differentiated technology, premium pricing, and strong adoption and exits. This is obviously an incredibly busy space. So if you're going to jump into a busy market, you better have differentiated data, a strong label, the ability to get reimbursement, because strategics aren't going to go after 5, 10, 15 million in sales in a very busy category. This has got to be a winner. And to me, that it almost has to be globally scalable. And you can look at the data on its face and be like, okay, this is going to be better than everything else out there. A me too in a very busy space is a tough deal to do.
Yeah, I think it's, well said by both Nick and Mike. I mean, specifically what Mike said, I think, do the right path first, right? I think if you get a generic FDA label for an allograft, And it's tough, right? I think the biggest question we're going to have then we have to sort of look at, okay, well, what were the marketing claims? What have you been posting on LinkedIn, right? Are you going to run awry there with, because you had a label that said something and you've been marketing something else? So the right path is often more expensive and it can be bridged, staged, but I think, have a pathway to get, to do the right label first. I think the challenge we see is, especially with allografts and a lot of these others, is there's not a lot of barriers to entry for that generic label. And so if somebody does step up and do all the hard work of funding clinical studies and everything else, and you don't really have any blocking path from a regulatory perspective, it's nothing to stop a whole bunch of others from popping up and, benefiting from all the tens of millions of dollars you spent validating and developing the market. So
I think it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, orthopedics sometimes struggles relative to other market segments to nail down and to get capital, right? I mean, in the med device venture world in the US, orthopedics only gets about 10% of venture capital over the last few years. And I think this may be, and I don't want to pick on this company, but the fastest path through the FDA isn't always the best one. And it's also not always the most valuable one. It's typically not the most valuable one. So be careful, because sometimes you'll have early investors or your board saying, hey, when are we going to get that FDA clearance, right? As opposed to, how do we generate the most value with this asset? So I would be less focused on, for any company, how fast you can get through the FDA. It's a bit more of, how do we create the most clinical and economic value, and can we put data behind that to prove it? Regardless of the pathway.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, so the bar is high, and with only 10% of medtech investment dollars going into ortho MSK, it kind of begs the question, who's going to fund the gap? And certainly we see some family offices that have, kind of bridged the gap and have sort of maybe even taken the position that was once consumed by the VCs. But we like angels, and I think that's kind of what, MSK Innovations is a blend of all of those. But how do you view things like crowdfunding? There's Reg CF, we've seen that, Reg A and D+. Where do you view that in terms of a company that you're going to invest in if they've already done that? Does that change how you view it? Because someone has to fund the gap.
Yeah, maybe since I'm early and our fund, jumps into that gap often. That's a bit of our thesis. I'll come to the crowdfunding thing at the end, but number one, have you maximized your non-dilutive options? Depending on where you are in the world, NIH, SBIR, ARPA-H, state matching funds, DOW, Israeli Innovation Authority, EIC. Are you tapping into and really maximizing your efforts to get non-dilutive capital? Number two, beyond friends and family, have you reached out to surgeons or surgeon physician syndicates? Because there are several out there, and angel groups, there's plenty there as well, to find, that first $1 to $3 million beyond your grants. I often see, and I look forward to where distributors or, manufacturing partners are willing to invest early, because that also, I'm looking for market symmetry. I'm looking for validation of who else thinks this is amazing besides you. And there are early stage venture funds, family offices, even deal by deal SPVs. That's how we did our last one, that are active in the window. I track about 40 early stage medtech investment funds around the world. So they're out there. And, we all know in the last 6 months have been more, successful capitalizations maybe than in the last 2 years. But there is some momentum building. I'm hearing of, closings, 3 to 5 million, almost every day now. So people are raising money, but the ones that I see raising money are out there hustling. They've been building the connections with us for years. They're willing to dig in, be persistent, and follow up. But there is early stage money out there. There's a lot less than there used to be. There's about 70% less early stage small funds in medtech than there was pre-COVID. So there's just less venture and early stage money to go around. So you've got to be hustling to find it. You're not going to find it sitting in your house on Zoom.
yeah, I don't have much to add beyond what Nick said. It's, if you pulled together, 100 seed or pre-seed cap tables, you probably see zero overlap. Right. I think it's just a mixed bag for every single one. And so I think the second thing you can do is, how do you make capital go further? And I think we've seen some creative strategies where companies are setting up subsidiaries in Australia where you get 40%, rebate on your R&D and clinical dollars. And so, there's certainly other opportunities like that where, dollar for dollar, you might be able to get more work done in the same capital. And so I'd say just rapid capital efficiency and being creative, I think is what enables you at least to make some of those dollars go further. But we've seen companies that have raised 10 million plus in non-dilutive funding, and so it's not a path for everyone, but it's been done. And so I'd say another thing is just find people that have done that, network with them, and figure out is there any learnings and anything you can do similar.
Yeah, shout out to Sonogen. They just got a non-dilutive, I think it was 800 grand. Is that right? So just exactly what you're talking about, grant money. How about you, Mike? Thoughts on who funds the gap?
Nothing to add. I think Nick and Greg hit it great.
Okay. So how about this question? This has come up a few times. How do you view the value of the little things like medtech innovator or things where companies pay money to enter a contest that they pitch a bunch of times and get awards and kind of work up the ladder? Does that mean anything to you? Do you think does that influence you at your level, or is that more just vanity? What are your opinions?
I don't think it's vanity. I think it's visibility.
Mhm.
And so if you go to MedTech Innovator and you're running up against a bunch of other companies and you have judges that are from the space and you do well, it means enough people have seen what you have to be interested. It doesn't, so it gives it visibility. It makes things might make it worth looking at more readily. So I think whether it wins an award or not, maybe less relevant, but I think if it's featured and doing well in those kinds of spaces, it means there's enough people around who see something there.
I thrown into two buckets. Those that are, and I think MedTech Innovator is a great example. I think in Asia, MedTech Actuator, there are various forums. They're credible. They have a history of success. They have a history of good companies coming through there. Those are good. There's the other bucket that sometimes take advantage of, especially in orthopedics, take advantage of companies that are trying to raise money. They know it's hard to raise money. So now you're paying to pitch and they fail to share their track record of success, right? Those you want to be careful of people that are asking you for large sums of money to have you pitch, and they're going to introduce you to some of these most amazing people in the world. I just say, give me a track record of success. But you got to be careful, especially because people know that orthopedics is a hard place to raise money. So be careful of the folks that are out there, paying to play that don't have a track record of delivery.
Yeah. How about you, Greg?
Yeah, I think Mike and Nick covered it well. I mean, you got to run down capital sources as creatively and opportunistically as you can. So I think all these platforms that give you visibility are a great opportunity.
So you touched on something there that I think has now reached a point where we're seeing some scams and some fraud. And had lunch with a CEO yesterday of an MSK company, and he shared with me that he got contacted by a company in Geneva, Switzerland, with a lot of interest in writing a big check, $15 million check, but he had to fly out to meet with them in person. And he actually did that, flew out there, and when he got there, and they had an LOI, they had all the terms that were there. It was all agreed upon, except the stipulation came once he was there that, oh, by the way, we need you to put, I think it was 1.5 million into crypto, into an account. As part of the deal, it's a showstopper. Now, this is after he flew to Switzerland. He's 2 days now, flew coach over the pond. He's now at great expense, and this caveat got thrown at him. So he came home kind of like, that's just weird. So he's like, we're not going to use our money. We'll use your money. You wire the money, then we'll put the crypto in. That's fine. He cleared it with attorneys. And so as it turned out, he asked around, talked to some people, and they said, anybody who's talking to you about kicking back crypto, it's a scam and you should run. The name of the company was Greenstand from Geneva, Switzerland. My understanding is there's another one in Netherlands that had a very similar strategy. So if you happen to be desperate or feeling desperate, the walls are closing in, and you're susceptible, you're vulnerable to being taken advantage of. And So I just want to throw that out there as a warning. Anything that you guys want to add to that?
I'd say
Yeah,
for our
I mean,
portfolio companies, I get, it's an email, it's 2 to 3 emails a week from people who, are offering to fund capital from various sources. It's just they're just blanketing, companies. So, there's no question some of them, many of them are never going to fund anything, but there's got to be some bad actors in it too.
yeah, I mean, there's a different scam I heard about this morning, that, a fund that says we're going to invest, but you need to pay us to do the diligence and you need to pay us a fee, to find you other investors. And, desperate companies, can sometimes bite on stuff like that, but you got to be careful because and I asked a couple of my colleagues and they'd all heard about it as well. But anybody that's reaching out to you through a cold text, a cold call on LinkedIn, or an email that you have no idea where it's coming from, that's a huge flag right off the bat. I don't know of any rounds that have been funded by the guy that sent you a text, saying, "Hey, you raising capital? I can find you $10 million." I think using your board, your leadership team, your advisors to get warm introductions to people, that goes so much farther than any sort of, cold outreach. So, if that's something to give to anyone, use your network and get warm intros. Because when I get any cold call on an email, I typically don't open it. I'm looking for a referral from somebody I know.
PJ, want to pull some questions in from?
Yeah, we have a big list, and while I'm reading through some of these extra questions, I just want to ask, a little bit more of an open-ended, where do you see the biggest opportunities right now in the market? Extremities have been growing at a higher rate than joints for a number of years. Where do each of you see potential opportunities over the next handful of years?
Well, I mean, I'm earlier stage, and I think I've always had an interest in procedures moving to the outpatient world, but those that can do that and be successful with ASC type economics, right? Everybody says, "Oh, it's outpatient X, Y, and Z," but can you actually be commercially viable in that space without taking a huge margin hit? Obviously, today, digital surgery, robotics, and AI. Is it value add AI? Please don't just chase AI. And I don't want to see any more decks where you've got an orthobiologic, but we've got an AI solution that we're going to add to that, and it's going to make it amazing. But I do think I've been putting my money where my mouth is for years now. I think there's a huge opportunity in therapeutics, drugs, and biologics around the musculoskeletal space, whether it's pain, osteoarthritis, degenerative disc disease, anti-infection, bone and tissue healing. I think combining biology with, mechanics is a big part of the orthopedics future, and we've been investing there, consistently, both at my time at J&J as well as at Neovate Capital.
I think tools to generate efficiency in operating rooms, both ASC and hospital. We're starting to see very high volume ASCs that many of us know about, but the vast majority are not running at that kind of pace, and very, very few hospital operating rooms are. And as we look through the economics of where MSK surgery is to come, we're going to have far greater throughput. And there's technologies, there's services, there's devices, there's management, there's all kinds of companies and tools out there to get after it. But we see a nice opportunity there. Enabling tech, obviously your faster growing device spaces like sports and extremities continue to be interesting.
Yeah, I think those are both great answers and similar theses for us. I mean, if you kind of step back and say, like, why does venture capital exist in MSK or medtech? I think, it's because big strategics are valued on growth and held accountable for earnings. And so I think the dynamic that creates is they can't invest in R&D the way that they might want to, right? And take risks on, longer timelines to commercialization. And so venture capital fills that gap, right? It takes on the risks of getting something to revenue generating and potential accretion. And so I think for us, the biggest thing we look at is, who's going to buy this and what avenue for growth are you solving for, and for how many people, right? If every person, you have the strategic logos on your pitch deck, but your product is a iteration on a product they already have. Well, in order for them to get $1 of growth, you have to cannibalize their entire business. And then, $1 is your growth there. And so I think it's really figuring out how do you, drive revenue in new markets for them that they either otherwise don't have exposure to, or just greenfield opportunities where nobody's really driving growth. But you have to have a story of how are you going to drive growth for somebody? Because ultimately that's the story that gets you acquired.
Question from the chat from Mark Maloney. What are your thoughts on platform technologies versus product-specific companies? Take multiple products, services around a condition. What are your thoughts on that versus we have one product, here's the application? Is that a challenge for the potential acquisition?
I think there's two components to it. One is a single product so specialized or small that commercializing around it's going to be quite difficult? Or is it something beefy that you can commercialize or integrate with other products that sales forces you might be able to get to will take on? So on one hand, it's commercialization. The other hand is at exit. If the exit is sale to a large company, products are generally more easily absorbed into current sales forces and current cost structures than platforms. But divisions are more valuable. And so if you can create a new division for an acquirer, you're doing something special. And obviously there's devil in the details of what kind of platform we're talking about. But if it's a bunch of different products around an indication, then you're really going to have buyers that want to have that business be in addition to what they have.
Yeah, if you in musculoskeletal, 40% of deals are partial deals, licensing deals, as opposed to acquisitions, asset acquisitions or company acquisitions. There are an increasing amount of, partial deals or licensing. But in a multiple clinical indication company or platform, you better prove that first one really well. Do not spend your resources don't spread it around like peanut butter. The first one, you got to go all in. And if you're going to claim that there's 2 or 3 other indications, if you haven't put any investment in it, you don't have any sort of even preclinical proof of concept, I discount that to 0.
Yeah, we had similar feelings. I think platform technologies definitely exist on paper. I think in reality, they're really tough to fund from a venture perspective because you end up with, the R&D budget of 1.5 companies or 2 companies and the revenue of 1, and so I think you got to focus and you got to go deep and you got to recognize that, yes, you could be using all these other indications and you may have to forego those to be focused and pursue something else. And there's creative things you can do around separating out the IP. But, I think the more you're creating a Venn diagram for your commercial call point and or your potential acquirers, the harder it is for us to want to put dollars into those opportunities.
All right, next question. For early stage commercial companies, what is the value to have OUS approvals and revenues? Are there some countries more influential to your evaluation of the company or no?
Depends on the technology, depends on the potential buyer group, how prevalent they are. It depends on price. I mean, you have some price in many countries in Europe where pricing is so tough that commercializing there is just going to be a massive cash drain. I think if something that could eventually be a large set of products or something large for a large acquirer, a large strategic, having a thing on the ground in Europe and on the ground in Asia certainly has those companies seeing that opportunity as well. I always say that the head of Asia Pac and the head of EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, usually has a vote when they're looking at stuff. And if they think there's a chance within the next year or 2 that they're going to be selling this product in their area as well, that's of more value to the big company. But every single country that you're in, no matter how big or small, is a massive opportunity cost drain on your management team. And so from my perspective, if I'm in Europe, I don't want to be in more than 1 country in Europe. If it's a US company, in Asia, I wouldn't want to be in more than 1 country in Asia because every additional country is an additional massive burden for management.
Yeah, if you can do R&D in another country to save money, like Greg said, tax credit in Australia, for example, if you can do a clinical trial somewhere that is quality, diverse patients that the FDA has historically accepted, and you can save yourself some money and move faster, great. If I see that slide and it says, I'm going to commercialize in the US, Asia, and Europe when I launch, like, no, you're not, right? If you haven't proven it in the United States, that's going to be the main driver of your exit. Until you do that, I want to see you max that out before I see you go into other countries. If you're killing it in the US, and it obviously makes sense to go to a few other countries because you're trying to get that $50-75 million in revenue, okay, but when it's your initial commercial launch, I'm looking for US first and everything else second. And typically I don't want to see the everything else.
And if it's a European company, I want to see them penetrating throughout Europe, not just in their home country, then hitting South America and parts of Southeast Asia. If they're in Europe and they're going to, that's where they're starting. I want to see success in multiple countries in Europe.
Yeah, we feel the same. Limited value, unless you can do it in a way that's, extraordinarily opportunistic and doesn't take a lot of time and bandwidth, and it's almost $3. I think it's your time and energy is much better spent in the US.
Are there any key countries that you recommend a startup have patent protection for outside of their main country, or the US?
I mean, your biggest ortho markets outside of the US are Germany, France, Japan, Korea. And if you nail those, you're covering a UK. You're covering a lot. It's hard. It's not going to stop a small player in a small market. Obviously, China for what it's worth. Although it's not a market where many companies are actively playing at this point.
Yeah, but 80 to 90% of orthopedics money is made in less than 10 countries. So make sure you're protected in those first, because those are the ones the strategics are going to care the most about. But obviously, listen to your lawyer and be smart about protecting some of the other countries too. But make sure you're wrapped up tight in the top 10.
What are your thoughts on companies that are working with an investment banker? How do you view that? Is that a good strategy? You think there's a better one?
It's expensive. So when you see small companies with investment bankers, you're like, oh, you're spending a lot of money on this. Maybe it's because you have a founder that doesn't really have any idea what to do.
Yeah,
So,
if you're trying,
you need to get advice from somebody.
Getting good advisors I agree. Getting good advisors is useful. If you're out doing a $5 million round and I'm hearing from the broker, dealer, or investment banker, there's something wrong. If you're trying to do a $50 million raise, and I'm private placements, banks do them selectively. M&A, certainly I think that it's warranted. On private placements, it's usually for the bigger ones. If I see bankers and broker dealers coming on the small ones, it's a red flag for me.
Yeah, there's exceptions to every rule, but I think it's a negative connotation. Especially if it's a bank or a group that you've never really heard of or don't have relationships with. So I would definitely caution. Nick said it best. I think if you can find your way to a warm intro, either through another portfolio company, an advisor, a connection, it's much better path.
You guys have any advice for the companies that are at the end of the line, running out of funds? How do we survive?
I think if they've exhausted their friends and family, there's venture debt out there. It can get very painful very fast. But it's there. But yeah.
Yeah. Have you done everything you can to preserve capital? Because when I see companies that are still, have a high burn rate, but they're like, we're running out of money. And I ask, well, what have you done to conserve cash? And it's nothing. So number one, you make sure you've conserved your cash. You've maximized your non-dilutive options. But if you're having trouble raising capital, ask not just yourself, but the people around you, sometimes the most objective people around you. Is it the product? Is it the way I'm telling the story? Or is it me? Right? And if it's, look, it comes down to the CEO so many times, and that's okay. If you need some help, you have to change your board, your advisors, take a different chair. But, it's usually one of those three: the product, the story, or the leadership. And, get that input and find out what's the root cause of your challenge raising money.
I mean, it's hard to know what to do at the end, but I think the advice of trying to preserve your capital as much as you can. And if we go to a meeting and you see how companies are operating in their booth, in their entertainment, in what they put together, I mean, you can quickly learn who's burning through cash at a much faster pace than they ought to. Go to their office, it can be shocking sometimes on how people are spending cash. But yeah, for me, and I'm mostly with our portfolio companies, especially if you have people who came from the large company world where every year it just reloads. You got a new budget and new cash. It's just constantly reiterating, it's one bucket of cash. Every dollar you spend is not coming back.
Yeah, that's great. Guys, really some phenomenal input. I appreciate your transparency and just being blunt. That's what I think was really called for. And today you all really did a terrific job. So thank you for that. If you have any last parting words that you want to say, I want to afford you that before we sign off.
I mean, reach out
Pearls?
to reach out to any and all of us if you have neat companies that need capital and support.
If you're trying to do something impactful, it's going to be hard. It's clear. Greg said it earlier. It's okay that you haven't done it before. Surround yourself by great people that can expand your network and get you in front of the right people that maybe you can't yourself. So again, surround yourself with great people.
And I think the one piece of advice I see over and over again is everyone tries to set as high a valuation in every round as they possibly can, and they constantly box themselves in corners by doing this. The valuations until professional money gets in are always astronomical. It's always then enormously painful when professional money comes in and has to give you a down round because you were getting your friends or doctors as investors and they were willing to accept a $50 million valuation for a company doing $500,000 in revenue.
Yeah, I'd close out just by saying we all really appreciate the entrepreneurs. I mean, this business doesn't exist without you guys, and you have to have irrational optimism to be an entrepreneur. And so I'd say just keep persevering, build a network, the best network you can. And I'd say build the relationships early, with all of us. I think more than happy to meet with anybody and try to, give any feedback we can that's helpful, even if it's too early for any particular one of our investment theses.
And Drue and TJ, thanks for putting this together.
Yeah, absolutely.
You bet. TJ, I guess I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for joining. This was a great event. Thanks, Nick, Mike, Greg. Really appreciate the wisdom and insight. And next month, we're back with another pitch event. Come join us. Drop the link to register in the chat and hope everyone has a great rest of their evening. Thanks for joining.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.